So who's really in charge of this world? Let's dive right in. James, I spent a lot of time over the last few weeks studying through the book of Daniel, and we're going to spend time in podcasts today and maybe in a few in the coming weeks talking about this great book. It ties into eschatology, end time events. There's a lot that Daniel has to say about the church. It's literally written into the pages of Daniel. And the third chapter of Daniel is one I want to focus on today. It's a chapter that speaks about an event that occurs in the life of the king. This dream comes, and as a result of this dream from chapter 2, where the king sees himself as a golden head on this statue, and Daniel then from that is explaining to him that there are 4 kingdoms that are in discussion, plus a 5th one. He's saying that out of all of that, you're the golden head of this wonderful statue. Well, the king takes it to heart. He gets full of himself. And in chapter 3, it says that he then goes and constructs this 90-foot tall, huge gold statue. And you can only imagine it's of himself because his image is, man, I'm not just the golden head. I am pure gold. Do you think we have world leaders that have that kind of ego today?
Oh, I think we've always had world leaders that have that, but who had the ability to actually pull that off? Was it gold plated or was it solid gold? Who knows? But yes, I think that's kind of the problem with when you give a person too much power and too much control, and they're not submitting themselves to God. Who knows what they will come up with? You know?
Yeah, I agree. I look at this story, and it says that Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits, again 9 feet wide, and he put it in the plain in the province of Babylon. And then Nebuchadnezzar sent word to everyone, all the leaders, and he says, verse 2, I want all of you to come together, and when you hear the sounds of the bagpipes and all the horns being sounded, verse 5, everyone is going to fall down and worship. But if you don't, then I'm going to cast you into a furnace of blazing fire. So that's pretty motivating to make you submit to what the king wants. Are we in a political climate today where we have people who think that they have that kind of control? They can just tell us what to do and we bow down. And how do you think that affects the church?
Oh, yeah. I mean, well, you look at Nebuchadnezzar here, and he's kind of modeling God in some ways, because those who do not submit eventually to God are thrown into a furnace on the last days. But the difference between the two is one is God and the other one is a man who has political authority. Now, when you take it to today's age, it's interesting how a lot of times there are groups who are anti-Christian because they say we're judgmental, but they're willing to not only judge us, but destroy our reputation and dismantle us because we don't agree with them.
Right.
So it's interesting how this happens not only in the past, but it's happening in some ways today as well.
I agree. Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 1, he conquers Jerusalem and he brings bondage, brings in captivity back people from the royal family. And it says in that first chapter that he has them placed under the care of the chief eunuch for the rule of the eunuchs. And I believe that ties straight back into 2 Kings 20, where it says that the prophecy was that the royal family would in essence be castrated. They would become eunuchs to the cause. And you can see that Nebuchadnezzar as king wants this to be a people of conquest. They're a conquested people. He wants them to be, he takes everything from them. He changes their names. These young men have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as they're known. Those are their Babylonian names. They are actually called Hananiah and Mishael and Daniel and Hananiah. Those are their Hebrew names, but they were stripped from them. And a great example of that is Daniel's name goes from being one that honors God to one that says, the God Baal will protect you. My God Baal will protect you, the king says. So the king brings these men in. Now, here's my question. Do earthly kings have the ability to overrule the overall plan of God? And what do we learn in the book of Daniel about that?
Well, the answer to that is no, they don't. And I think in the book of Daniel, I think you actually see that on display. I think you very much see what happens when the will of the most powerful man on earth then collides with the will of God. And I think that's what you get in the book of Daniel.
Well, that third chapter, he says in verse 15, when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, I'll call them by their Babylonian names, even though I would imagine they hated that. Everything's been stripped from you. You're not allowed to honor your God. We're going to change your name so they don't have Hebrew names. We're going to give you all names that honor pagan gods. We're going to castrate you so you can't have any lineage, anything to come after you. We'll strip you of hope and identity.
Yeah.
And now he says, you need to fall down and worship this monstrosity that I've erected. And the men say, no, we're not going to do it. And the king says in verse 15, you'd better, when the sound of the horns come, you had better, because if you don't, I will immediately cast you in the midst of the blazing fire. And listen to this now. What God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? What God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? When I read that, this is a king who thinks way too highly of himself, that he has more authority than he does. I've referenced that back to 2 Kings 18:19 in my Bible that says, what is this confidence that you have? Well, the confidence that these men had is they knew who the real ruler of the world was.
Yeah.
Now, the United States today, I think a lot of people are fearful of the government. They're fearful of the turn of events in places like the Ukraine, the rise of China and Russia and its power. I think there's fear that maybe God's losing control of this. What confidence would you give those folks?
Well, I would point them to the book of Daniel, actually. Seriously, because it's like, hey, do you want to see a group of believers who went through a hard time? The book of Daniel is a great example. And they served a God who was able to overcome the most intense, hottest situations, literally, because he is able.
So when the king says, I'm going to throw you in the fire if you don't bow down, and their response is, verse 16, O king, we don't even need to give you an answer concerning this. What they're saying is, I really don't have anything to say to you about this. What do you want from us? If it be so, we're not going to do this.
Yeah.
Our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the blazing fire. He will deliver us out of your hand, O king. What God who can deliver you out of my hands? Verse 17, he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he doesn't, let it be known, O king, we're not going to serve your gods or worship. There's a song that I think it's the group called Mercy Me wrote years ago, and it says, I know you're able, I know you can, save through the fire with your mighty hand. But even if you don't, our hope is you alone.
Yeah.
I find that song really captures well the intent of this passage, which is we trust God and know that he turns world events no matter what.
Yeah. Well, this prayer, first of all, this is the prayer that my mom used when she had cancer. She says, I know that you're able to deliver me from cancer, but even if you don't, I will still serve you. This is the prayer that I did also with my son who went into hospital 6 weeks ago and is now out and perfectly healthy. But I have found when you surrender completely to the will of God and you say, you decide, I know you're able, but no matter what happens, you're still my God. God loves that prayer. And when I look at this passage, I immediately remember Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's standing there. This is the day before he's crucified. In verse 39, he says, "And when he went a little beyond them and fell on his face, praying, saying, My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." Now, what's interesting about Jesus' prayer is he's saying, in essence, the same thing that the Hebrew boys said in the furnace. However, God's plan is different in this situation. He wanted to deliver the 3 Hebrew boys from the furnace, but in this situation, God sends his only son and allows him to go through the death. Why? Because he shows that he can even defeat death. And in a way, he even kind of alludes to that in the story of the 3 Hebrew boys. They're standing in the midst of fire. They should be dead, but God holds back death because he is able.
Wasn't that true? He cast them in, verse 24, and it says, not 3 men were cast in. There were 3 men cast in there, weren't there? Certainly, O king. And the king said, look, I see 4 men, and they're loosed, and they're walking about in the midst of the fire. They're not harmed. And the appearance of the 4th one is like a son of God. Yeah. And the king comes near, and he yells out their name, and he says, come here. And they come out of the fire, and he is amazed. God is saying through this deliverance, this was a moment when God needed to deliver his people.
Yeah.
The fiery furnace had to be there in order to give all the rest of the Jews in the land confidence that God can deliver you if you'll stand up and do the right thing, even when it seems like the price is too high.
That's right. And I think that's the thing is that what do you put your hope in? What are you standing for? But you have to raise the question to the church today. Church, are you willing to stand in the furnace? Or are we really trying to avoid those opportunities to glorify God? Because I guarantee the reason why this is written down and remembered is that this impacted the entire region when the story of this got out.
Absolutely.
And guess what people were thinking? Wow, I think the God of these guys is the real deal here. Because that's not possible.
And even the king says right there,
Yeah.
now, okay, this guy must be, this is the real God. I mean, I don't want if anyone in the whole country speaks bad about their God, we're going to wipe them out and annihilate them.
Yeah.
So honor is brought to God. The Jews are encouraged, and the seed of Judah through which the Christ would come is preserved. And that was the key of Daniel is, look, I'll do whatever I have to do. Even if there's only a remnant left, I will be sure that my people survive. So 70 years of captivity, that's what the book of Daniel deals with, from start to finish. And in the midst of that story, God is saying, look, I will do whatever's necessary, whether it's delivering people from a fiery furnace, whether it's putting people in positions close to the king so that I have a platform, a canvas upon which to paint who I am so the king will not annihilate my people, whether it's the lion's den that will come later in the book, with a new ruler, with a new country, the Medo-Persians now in charge. Whoever it is, I will do what is necessary. You don't worry about that. You just stay faithful. I think that's the mistake we make in our country. We don't realize our role is different than God's role sometimes, and we second guess or try to help him.
Well, it's interesting because, the real takeaway from this is that Nebuchadnezzar is not in control. God put him there. And, a passage I was studying this past week was the judgment of Egypt. And to me, it's so interesting because you see that God has the final say in things. And with Egypt's judgment, he goes in there and he says, I'm going to cause confusion. I'm going to hand you over to evil. And this passage here just kind of reminded me a little bit of what is going on maybe perhaps in our modern day politics. But you jump down to verse 11 after he pretty much causes confusion on Egypt.
This is Isaiah 19.
Isaiah 19 and verse 11, it says, the prince of Zoan are mere fools. The advice of Pharaoh's wisest advisors have become stupid. I just love that. It says that, how can you men say to Pharaoh, I am a son of the wise, a son of ancient kings? And God is causing all this. He's taking full credit that he's literally made the leadership of Egypt stupid.
They put an idiot in charge.
Which means that they don't realize that. They think they got it going on. But God is saying, no, what you're doing is dumb, and I'm going to use that for your own judgment.
So what you're telling me is that God takes world leaders and he puts them in positions of authority, but then he turns their hearts the way that he will, the way that he desires, so that world events turn out perfectly to accomplish his plan.
Absolutely. And that's why you have to walk by faith and say, God, what do you want me to do in this instance? Should I run so I'm never put into a position where you're glorified? Or should I be sensitive to what you're trying to do and see if I can put myself in a position that brings glory to your name, so that people know that you are the one true God?
What you're telling me is without the fiery furnace, God never would have had the chance to have delivered them in this miraculous way that says, ooh, glorify God. And in the person of Christ, we see torture and death come, but it all happens in a way, in a perfect environment where God can say, ooh, look at this, look at Christ, glorify God. And how about 1 Peter chapter 4 that speaks about us? And it says, there are some of you that are about to suffer, but remember, if you suffer according to the will of God, just entrust your soul to a faithful Creator. Doesn't that phrase capture Daniel in the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, Jesus at the cross? It captures all of it, and it captures really where we should be at spiritually, which is, Lord, I entrust my soul to you as the faithful Creator and say, do as you will, turn the world the way that you desire. Instead of me trying to fight, let me understand the ground you're tilling and go plant seed there.
And when you put your trust in the Creator, you know that the better days are ahead, that at the resurrection of the dead, that's what it's all about. And it's okay that this world is passing away.
So there's no reason to fear the political leaders that are in place. They're there by the hand of God.
Perhaps forgotten in eternity. They're important now, but not in 1,000 years.
There's a passage that says God puts the weakest of men in power. And I think that's because they're the most easily manipulated. And for that reason, I've really quit placing much emphasis on the politics of the moment, who the current world leaders are, what the world environment is, the war in the Ukraine. I pray certainly for comfort for those that are hurting. I'm not diminishing that. But what I am saying is that when we as Christians get lost in the temporal world, we forget that this battle involves the spirit world as well, and that God is behind the scenes, and all of this is being manipulated to his advantage. He doesn't cause bad things to happen, but he causes all things to work for his good.
Instead of getting caught up on the temporal, ask, what is God trying to accomplish right now?
Yes.
And then become a part of that.
That's right. So Nebuchadnezzar, boy, a pawn in the hand of God and didn't even know it. Well, we've had a good discussion today about this wonderful subject of how God intervenes in world affairs. I hope it's helped you to realize that you have a place in this world, but it's not really associated with the temporal, it's the spiritual that matters. So let's go to war, but let's remember who the enemy is. It's not flesh and blood. It's against those principalities and powers in heavenly places. We'll see you next time.